All right. It is the week of July 25th, 2022, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and today we're going to talk about Paddy Pimblett and Molly McCann. Are they the UFC's new type of superstar? There's been a lot of discussion about these two becoming crossover stars, being the next Conor McGregor or Ronda Rousey. Yes, I've actually heard that from people. We're going to break down the differences between Paddy and Molly versus Conor and Rousey, as well as how the UFC is kind of building a new type of crossover star that doesn't fit the traditional pattern we've seen in the past. So I'll dissect all of that. Then we're going to talk about an update in the UFC Antitrust Lawsuit case. One of the experts for the fighters in the case has come under fire for some separate work he's done, and it could end up affecting the actual antitrust lawsuit case as well as his testimony, which is kind of a big part of it. So we'll break all of that down and see what the implications are. Then we're going to do our quick hit sections where we'll talk about a couple of one championship events as well as a new sponsor for the UFC. And finally, we're going to talk about fighter wage share and what fighters are actually being paid out. Interesting discussion that I saw on Twitter. Wanted to kind of dive into this a little bit more. There's a lot of misconceptions about this that we need to kind of just tackle and look at from a business perspective. So I'm going to do all of that. Timestamps at the bottom as always. And with that in mind, let's go ahead and dive right in. All right. First subject we're going to talk about today, Paddy Pimblett and Molly McCann. Are they the next Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey? And is the UFC building a new type of superstar that's different than McGregor and Rousey? So the answer to those questions, before I dive into them, is no and yes, respectively. When you look at Paddy Pimblett, right, and the kind of following he's amassed, you watch the UFC Fight Night London card, the crowd just roaring for him. It's definitely got an aura of someone who could end up being that guy, right? You've had Dan Hardy said that he believes Pimblett could be the next Conor McGregor. Dana White has hinted at it a little bit. Hasn't said it outright, but it said he definitely has potential and talked about how he put a stare down between Pimblett and Jordan Levitt on his Instagram and only got several 100,000 followers. Pimblett put it on his personal Instagram. It got like 2.7 million views. So he's got a following. There's no doubt about that. But the interesting thing here is when we've traditionally looked at what makes a true superstar in the sport, right? It's usually three things. It's continually winning, right? And having exciting fights and having a personality. Those are the three main things. To get to the true crossover level as well, you generally have someone that becomes champion. It is hard to have somebody become a crossover star without being champ and holding the belt. A couple of examples, right, would be Nate Diaz, Jorge Masvidal. But even in those situations, they had to take it from, well, at least in the Diaz situation, right? He had to beat Conor McGregor, who was on top of the world at the time that he lost to Diaz. And then Masvidal just really capitalized on some fantastic performances and had that big winning streak. Part of the reason why you generally have someone that gets that crossover power with the belt is because, again, they have to keep winning, right? And they usually get pushed up the ladder pretty fast. We've seen in the past, McGregor got not a super fast push, but a pretty, expedited push to the belt. Cody Garbrandt, right? His push and his immediate before he lost in his title defense, when he got the title, beat Dominic Cruz, all of that, he was getting a push. He was becoming more mainstream. He got a super fast push. I think he went from number 10 or 11 to number 7. And then for the belt, I believe that's the case. It was only one or two ranked guys before he got a crack at the title. This is traditionally how things have been done. But the UFC has kind of, I think, figured out a new model. right? They don't care as much about pay-per-view superstars as they used to. They don't need them as much. It would still be nice to have them. It still does give them revenue growth, right? If you've got somebody who goes out there and sells 800K to a million buys or a million plus, right? That's really big time. That still gives you a bunch of extra revenue. That still gives you more eyes on the sport that might convert casuals into hardcore fans. And so with that, they still want to make superstars like McGregor, Rousey, all those guys. John Jones back in the day, 2015, 2014, John Jones. They still would like that. And so what they've done is very clever, because if you look at Paddy Pimblett and Molly McCann's records, right? These fighters are not world beaters. Pimblett has done very well in his UFC run, but he also lost to a couple guys that washed out of the UFC, at least one in Nad Naramini. Now, that was a couple of fights ago, and of course, Pimblett is young and he could pivot and make those adjustments, but he has never looked like a world beater. If you watched him in Cage Warriors, he won belts, but he's never looked like a world beater, right? It wasn't like Conor, who lost to Joe Duffy and then went out there and just had the swag and was knocking people out, was just looking untouchable. Or Rousey, right? Those two looked, on their rise, looked literally untouchable. Paddy and Molly, especially Molly, which we'll get to in a second, it looked very human, extremely human. And again, Paddy can ride these wins, and as his skills improve, could hypothetically get to a belt. I'm not going to rule that out. I don't personally think he will. I think he will probably get tapped out somewhere in the top 15 or right outside the top 15, but it's possible. He's young enough. He can make adjustments, right? We've seen this before. I mean, look at Charles Oliveira. It's definitely possible for that to happen. He's got plenty of time. He is improving, so we'll see. Molly McCann, on the other hand, is a very interesting situation, because she, again, kind of got her foot in the door by a little bit riding Paddy's coattails. Right? She definitely, has latched on to Paddy's star power and then kind of made it her own. And her last two fights, she was kind of a decision machine, but her last two fights, she's gotten knockouts. That being said, if you look at the competition that Molly has fought, right? Hannah Goldie is probably getting cut after this loss. Her last knockout, Luana Carolina, also, I think she's still with the promotion, but also definitely on the verge of getting cut. In fact, just looking at it here, right? She is 8-3. Okay, so she's not going to get cut right away, but I mean, definitely not top tier. It's looking at her record, and then especially her two losses in the UFC, which are Talia Santos and Laura Procopio, I think I'm saying it right, in kind of boring decisions. I don't see her bouncing back and becoming a world beater, right? She is kind of, it's tough. It is really tough to look at her fights and think that she's going to make any sort of run at the title. But then again, you look at how the crowd reacted for her, right? You look at Dave Portnoy just losing his mind and kind of attaching himself to those two, which is crossover in some ways. That's important. And this is, again, kind of what the UFC has done here. And I think Sean O'Malley is the first case of this, to be honest. I think with Sean O'Malley, they realized that he could be a draw, right? He's talked about how well he's sold merchandise, how well tickets have moved because of him. He could be a draw, and he could, I don't want to say crush cans, but kind of crush cans, fight older guys that are not anywhere near the top 15 or any of that, and still be a big draw. And he, lost against Vera, and that kind of set him back a little bit, but he's still pulling big numbers kind of outside the top 15 because of the persona they've made for him and because of his performances earlier on. I think when they saw the UFC, saw that they could do that with O'Malley, they started to realize that if you're a fighter with really good personality or, you have good knockouts or submissions, finishing technique, whatever you want to call it, and you've got a personality and you could talk on the mic and all that, unless you really look outrageous and you're just blowing through competition, I mean, just destroying them, I think the UFC realized that from a matchmaking perspective, it makes far more sense to take those guys and kind of insulate them a little bit, because the more casual fans, and even some of the hardcore fans, to be honest, will accept that. Will accept can crushing. Right? We've talked multiple times about other champions in other promotions or contenders in other promotions and how they can get a following among the hardcore base. And they're fighting people that are essentially cans or don't have a great record, at least, are decent at best, right? I think the best example of this, and I might get flack for it, but I mean, if you look at the records, Kayla Harrison, right? She has beat no one of notable stature. And I mean, at 145 and 155, because she has had, I think, 1 or 2 wins at 145. But at 155, I mean, right, there's almost nobody there. You've got Cyborg, Julia Budd and her were supposed to fight, but Julia got injured. That would have been a big name in her cap. But you've seen this hype around, Kayla Harrison is this huge thing. And the UFC was going to bring her in and do Harrison versus Nunes and all of that before Nunes lost to Pena originally. But we haven't actually seen her tested. But it didn't matter because she was still going out there and winning and looking dominant, had enough of personality that she was kind of, propelling the entire PFL. She held the PFL together through their initial start, right? And I think the UFC realized, between looking at some of that and then with what Sean O'Malley was doing numbers-wise when he was fighting people that have either retired or been cut from the UFC, you don't need to have these guys have belts a lot of the times to get that initial pull. Now, I think there is a ceiling there, and I think the UFC knows it. And eventually, right, most of these fighters want to be the best in the world. They want to have a belt, so they're going to ask for tougher opponents. Case in point, Sean O'Malley fighting Pedro Munoz, and then now scheduled against Petr Yan. But if they slow play them, they can get more money out of them initially, and then if they end up losing or it ends up turning south, well, at least they got more bang for their buck, rather than, hey, we think this guy is going to be amazing, aka Cody Garbrandt. You put a bunch of marketing behind him, all of that. And Garbrandt, to his credit, did win the belt, did have a huge run up, right? But he does all that, and then he loses the belt, and then kind of just goes on a not so great streak, and it kind of kills his momentum. Even Adesanya in a way, right? They kind of rushed him a little bit up through the ranks. And again, to Adesanya's credit, he's technically not lost on paper and done what he's needed to do to hold the belt. So, that kind of worked out in their favor. But had they slow played Adesanya a little bit more, I think the hype could have been even bigger by the time he made his run for the belt. Right. But again, as a fighter, you get lower pay without being champion. You lose out in certain sponsorships, all of that stuff. Ngannou might be the biggest example that I can actually think of now that I'm kind of wheels turning on this, is Francis Ngannou's first run, right? When he fought Stipe Miocic, there was buzz around Ngannou that you hadn't seen on a heavyweight for a long, long time. And then he got 50-45 in a very boring title fight. And even when he came back and won the belt, it's great, but nowhere near the same hype. I think if the UFC had kind of slow played him a little bit more, which he was knocking guys out super fast, so that's kind of hard, right? But still, slow played him a little bit more, gave him a little bit more experience. I think he could have been even bigger, even if he lost the title fight and then came back. It's tough. But again, even thinking through that whole scenario, it's hard to say because especially back then, you didn't have the ESPN deal in place. So it's definitely a new model, though, the UFC has adapted moving forward. I think Paddy and Molly are prime examples of this because especially Molly McCann, keep putting her up against top 30, 40, lower end competition, have her go out there, do a show, win. And, if she continues to win, then maybe start getting her in the 20s, maybe a top 15 opponent, somebody ranked, but slow player because you've seen her lose boring decisions before. And right now she has steam that's building. And if you can continue to build that steam before she loses, you're still going to make more money out of it, especially from merchandise, from other things outside of pay-per-view buys, right? I mean, when you talk about selling out a crowd in the UK or renegotiating TV rights deals, which the UFC did off of the last time they had a card in London. At the O2. That's important. And that's what Molly can be. Paddy, same type of deal. And again, if you slow play Paddy enough and give him time to make adjustments as he's learning, you might get to avoid a situation like Charles Oliveira where, let's say they throw Paddy into the deep end, right? Put him against a top 10 opponent and then a top 5. Let's say he loses to one of those guys. Then he goes back, makes some adjustments, all of that. Then he all of a sudden wins the belt. That's great, but he won't have the same power in terms of drawing, in terms of selling merchandise, as he would have if you had slow played him and he kept winning on his way up. And that's not to say that he wouldn't, if Paddy follows a similar career path as Charles Oliveira, I'm not saying that if he gets the belt eventually, he won't have drawing power when he's champ, right? I'm not saying that at all, but he would have more if he won the whole time. That seems to be pretty clear in terms of what we've seen with previous champs and previous superstar potential. So again, I think the UFC's kind of picked up on this. I would expect as more and more bright prospects start to come up through the ranks, you're going to see them slow played rather than, hey, we're going to rush them into a title because they're not relying on that pay-per-view revenue split anymore, right? They don't need another Conor McGregor right now. They would be fine without it. Instead, get them a following, get them to sell merch, and then the bigger following they have too, when they hit their first loss, the more they're able to bounce back, right? Yes, you'll lose some of the fair weather fans, you'll lose some casual fans, sure, but if you have a big enough following, when you get your first loss, you run into adversity, if you're one of those guys, you can bounce back much, much easier, and you'll still keep some of them. Not everyone is going to look and say if Paddy loses in his next fight, oh man, like he's washed up, he's nothing, whatever, we're done. That's not going to happen. And if you continue to have him knock people out for another 3 or 4 fights, it's going to be even less people that leave the Paddy Pimblett bandwagon, right? That's the way to play this. And I think that's what the UFC's kind of realized is let's slow play these guys now instead of rushing them. So again, I think at this point, the UFC is adopting a new kind of model for their superstars, for their ambassadors of the sport, for people they want to push. And you'll be able to tell when they think they've got something if that person is, again, I hate to say crushing cans, but fighting competition that is clearly beneath their skill or should be beneath their skill, right? If they're delivering exciting finishes, They're talking on the mic. They've got a good personality backstage, all that stuff. Expect them to be heavy favorites for several fights moving forward. That would be my guess. Let me know your thoughts on this as well, especially if you think that Paddy Pimblett or Molly McCann could make that transition into becoming another McGregor or Rousey. I don't see that for either of them. Again, I think they both have ceilings that are pretty clear, and they could surprise me. That would be fine, but I don't see it right now. So let me know your thoughts on that, but also let me know if you agree that this is what the UFC has started to do, because to me it seems pretty obvious that they're taking a new direction with building stars, and I think it's a smart business move, right? I think it works because even if you slow play somebody who ends up being the next McGregor or Rousey, great. You've just given them more aura by the time that they reach the belt. It doesn't actually hurt your sales or your overall finances that much. I guess it delays some of the pay-per-view buys you might get, right? Because you could put them on a pay-per-view later, but it does a much better job of filtering out those that will never be McGregor or Rousey and still getting more out of them, which is the end goal. Because you're going to have a lot more of those fighters than you're going to have those, 1 in a million that transcend the sport. So let me know your thoughts on all this. But yeah, that's what I think on the Paddy Pimblett, Molly McCann situation. And yeah, we'll see what happens as time goes on. All right. Next thing we have today is an update in the UFC Antitrust Lawsuit case, or an indirect update rather. So Andrew Zimbalist, who is a expert witness for the plaintiffs or the fighters in the case, his analysis along with Hal Singer's is what the plaintiffs are relying on for their argument that they have an antitrust lawsuit case, right? When we talk about wage share and all that fun stuff, which I won't get into in super detail here. I've got plenty of episodes on the podcast about it if you want to search through the library. But when we talk about that stuff, they're relying on these financial models and these economic models from those two experts, Hal Singer and Andrew Zimbalist. Zimbalist has recently come under fire for, I guess, really a critique of another economist paper, J.C. Bradbury, and shout out to Professor Paul Gift, as always. And Paul, if you're listening, are you a doctor? I feel like you're a doctor, but I'm not 100% sure. Either way. He, mentioned this on Twitter, and I dived into it a little bit because it is important, where Sean Charles Bradbury, who is a economist, essentially wrote a piece regarding the report commissioned by the Atlanta Braves on the fiscal impact of Truist Park and the Battery Atlanta, which is, for those of you uninitiated to baseball, is essentially talking about the impact of the entire stadium, baseball stadium, Atlanta Braves baseball stadium, and the surrounding area where they have, people walking around and bars and all that fun stuff. And in this report, Bradbury finds that there was a negative fiscal impact on Cobb County, where the stadium is housed, by the building of the stadium and the Battery Atlanta, which you never want to see, right? If you're a government official or anything like that, you always have, you don't know anything about the way stadiums are built and how that whole process works, right? Essentially, the city, county, government has to kind of, sometimes state, but usually just city and county. Only once, I think, I can think of a time a state got involved. Lobbies for a stadium to be built, works with a professional team on it, and then usually raises bonds, and taxpayers end up paying for it through these bonds and all of that. But they have to sell like, hey, this is going to give us a positive impact of $300 million to our economy, right? Because you'll have small businesses come in and sell stuff there. And you'll have all these tourists who will come to watch games at the stadium, who will then go to the surrounding business areas, who will pay sales tax and all these things that will go back into our community. It's a whole fun process. And so this report is essentially saying, like, yeah, this actually hurt our economy, which is rare that you see one of these reports. And so Zimbalist essentially critiqued this report and said, nope, this isn't right. These findings I didn't get, I wasn't provided, or rather Bradbury didn't provide some of the data that he referenced. Says, all this stuff that's literally at one point says, which is highlighted here in this thread at JC Bradbury on Twitter. This particular piece stood out to me that's highlighted is a second possible explanation is that Bradbury deployed the synthetic control methodology to estimate the counterfactual growth in sales taxes. If he performed a synthetic control exercise to arrive at $3 million estimate for counterfactual growth in sales tax revenue, then he should have stated so explicitly and provided details on the donors and covariates, which he did in that piece. In reading this piece, and it took me a while to read all this because this is very economic heavy stuff. But so that's essentially Zimbalist saying, like, if this is the way Bradbury did this, he should have provided the information, in which case Bradbury then in this Twitter thread goes like, hey, here's all the stuff that I actually did provide. Everything you're saying I don't provide here is definitely in here. Something Bradbury mentions in this, which definitely is just coming out swinging a little bit, is a huge deficiency is that he accuses me of not providing information that I clearly included. Whether this is the result of negligence, incompetence, or deliberate misrepresentation of my work, this erroneous accusation is inexcusable in professional and scholarly discourse, which is a very harsh reprimand of Zimbalist. And again, if you're not familiar in academic circles, I know a lot of this stuff, and again, I'm no expert, but I've at least been exposed to it through some of my family who is in academia. That is a pretty scathing retort. That's what I'll leave it at. And throughout this whole, Twitter thread and all this other stuff that's happening, because Bradbury essentially, again, files an official reply to Zimbalist's comments on all of that. It definitely takes shots at Zimbalist's credibility, some of his analyses. Again, Bradbury says in this thread, the alternate estimates he presents are nothing more than speculative projections, which are based on rosy / unrealistic assumptions. He assumes excessive revenue growth, too little crowding, too low a discount rate, but then presents a sensitivity analysis that demonstrates Zimbalist's model is highly sensitive, which means that based on the model Zimbalist is given, if you change one variable, it skews everything quite a bit, right? That's how sensitive is each variable. If I change something, if I've got a small dial and I tweak it a little bit, how much does it change everything? And it's one of those things where reading through Bradbury's rebuttal, it seems very up on the up and up, and it could definitely undermine Zimbalist's credibility. That is not great for the fighters in the antitrust lawsuit case. Reason being, if you've only got two experts, and we've talked about this previously, where they're using economic models that are not widely accepted, right? Essentially, Singer's model is attempting to show, which I'm not saying it's wrong or anything in that regard. I do not know enough about it, right? I've talked to John Nash about it a bunch. I've talked to a bunch of other people that are more involved in it. Read Paul Giff's work on it. I don't know whether or not it is truly accurate or not, but either way, it goes against the traditional models. So it's a novel type of use of this modeling in theory. And so that already puts you behind the 8 ball a little bit. You now have the other expert, right? That is a key witness in your case who is in a separate incident, essentially being accused of pretty damning negligence. And that could easily undermine his credibility and come back to the UFC antitrust lawsuit case if, the UFC defense lawyers decide to bring it up, right? And this, again, we're not even out of the whether or not this is class certified or not. Judge Boulware still has not gave us a decision, which is insane. He's essentially signaled he was going to certify the class, but it's been over a year. Plaintiffs asked for them to kind of move it along and make a ruling, and he just still has not done that. But if this gets to trial and actually goes that way, this is a blow to the plaintiff's case, right? This will almost certainly, I would imagine, this would almost certainly be used against Zimbalist because they will look for those same type of practices that he used in this study, or report on this study rather, in the antitrust lawsuit case against the UFC. And my indication is that there's some overlap. I don't know exactly. Again, I'm not an expert on this, so it's hard for me to say like, oh, this is, the same type of stuff he's saying in the antitrust lawsuit case. But it's either way, the defense is going to spin it as a negative, and it's going to end up biting the plaintiffs a little bit. It will depend on how well the plaintiff's lawyers can handle it, all of that, the judge, of course, but it's not good. It is not good to have this come out against one of your key witnesses, right? So we won't see anything as a result of this in the MMA antitrust lawsuit case probably for quite some time. I mean, definitely not until Boulware certifies the class, which then will almost certainly be appealed. It could come up in the appeal, but we'll see on that. Either way, it's still a long way down the road, but this is definitely ammo that the UFC's lawyers will take advantage of. So not a great time for the fighters. How damaging this piece is still very much unknown, but it's not good. I will put it that way. So as soon as I know more, I will let you know. But yeah, not a great time. All right. Next up is our quick hit sections. A couple of things we want to tackle today. Brendan Shaub has signed a deal to produce content for One Championship, according to an interview he did with the Schmo. It's not a bad get, honestly, right? We saw Jimmy Smith announce and kind of, be the main guy for the Amazon deal. Shaub is another name in the MMA community, especially the hardcore MMA community. He's got ties to Joe Rogan, which is never bad if you're looking for press. Negative or positive, that depends, but still, he's got influence, right? And he's kind of made a name for himself now at this point. So not a terrible call for them to pick him up. We'll see what kind of content he's actually doing. I know Food Truck Diaries was popular, right? What he was doing for Showtime was getting some good traction before he essentially signed his replacement in Luke Thomas for Morning Combat. I think it's not an awful call for one who's trying to get more into the U.S. market. This is a name that U.S. fans, especially hardcore MMA fans, will know and recognize. It makes perfect sense to bring someone like him in. How long it will be, what type of content he'll produce for the promotion, we'll see. But either way, it's a notable get and a strategic move, I believe, by One to make content with someone who will help in the regions they're trying to gain market share in. So let me know your thoughts on that. I know people have very polarizing thoughts on Brendan Shaub, but let me know if it influences you at all as a fan, if you watch one or if you don't watch one, how much of a boost do you think it will actually do? Because I'm curious to hear from some of you guys on that. In other one news, OK versus Lee, which I believe is 160, is going to be another closed door event. That makes 5 closed door events in a row. This information coming from at Global Services, our boy Jonathan of Kowloon, my boy. And so he's essentially mentioned that, this will be another closed door event. They've done a lot of closed door events. Obviously, the Johnson Moraes rematch, that will be a ticketed one. But here's the thing, right? Obviously, the UFC came in, had a big show, sold it out in Singapore, and a lot of people are questioning why one isn't doing more events. Does that weaken one or whatever? We've talked about it a little bit on here, but if you're not able to, especially as you're doing, let me rephrase it this way. If you're expanding in certain areas and strategic moves, right? You've got to make sure that you're still doing your due diligence on cost. And live events are pretty costly, especially if those live events are not netting the type of gate that can offset the production costs, the fighter pay you're going to always have to do, but production costs, the arena, all that fun stuff. There's a lot that goes into all that stuff. That's part of the reason that Dana White and the UFC built the Apex, was so that they could have fight night cards there, produce them there, and save a ton on costs. Right? That's a huge reason why that place exists. And that was in the works before the pandemic, where they were going to produce content. They were going to have certain fights and things there. Pandemic gave them an excuse to host pretty much all the cards there. And then now, as time has gone on, right, that's their home base for fight nights. You've got fight nights in Austin. You've got fight nights in London, in cities, Columbus. You're going to still have that traveling type of show, but a lot of the cards are just going to be in the Apex because they're going to save money. And so as one is starting to make this push to get into the States, to make a bigger international footprint, is it worth the production costs? Are they making enough money where it makes sense to them, right? What's the opportunity cost is the real question there. Could that money instead be spent in other ways, in advertising and targeting other markets they want to move to, versus advertising shows, paying people for the tickets, all that stuff? So it is what it is. You can make your own inferences there in terms of why that's happening. But I would not expect one to do just like the UFC is doing. I wouldn't expect one to do ticketed events unless it's big shows moving forward, at least right now, while they're trying to expand. That's my take on it, which, again, easy to make inferences there. I will let you guys make whatever inferences you need, but that would be my assessment of what's happening in that situation. And then lastly, for the quick hit section today, we have to talk about OnePlus smartphones, which you'll have seen if you watched the UFC 277 embedded. So that is a new sponsor for the UFC. OnePlus is a Chinese smartphone company that was founded in 2013. I don't know a ton about the actual company itself, other than what I've been able to kind of see through their website or some of the other stuff I've seen. But in terms of, again, a new sponsor that is reaching a global base, that China's one of the UFC's newer biggest markets, right? And this is an easy way for them to continue expansion into those areas. We've seen that sponsorship has been a huge part of what the UFC has been doing the past couple of years. This is just another example of, got another brand to give us a bunch of money, this time for embedded, and it's in a location that is something that they want to expand into. You're just going to keep seeing more of this, right? It's a new sponsorship. I don't know the details on the sponsorship itself, but new sponsorship in a growing region that they're trying to continue to make gains in. So not surprising. You're going to see this more and more. Wouldn't I just am waiting for another rankings list to be sponsored outside of Battle Motors for the light heavyweights. So we'll see. We'll see when that happens. I gotta imagine it's going to happen sometime, but who knows? It is what it is. So those are the quick hit section. Let me know if I've missed anything from the past week. Anything else you guys want to talk about? Your thoughts on the One News as well as OnePlus. If you're an international viewer and you have any insight into OnePlus, more than happy to hear that in case I've missed something. Because again, I just have kind of a surface level knowledge base on that. But yeah, that's our quick hits for this week. All right. Last thing I want to talk about today is fighter wage share and fighter payouts. And the fact that there's quite a discrepancy between what some fighters make and what their share of overall revenue is, right? So reason I wanted to go over this is I'd seen a conversation. I couldn't quite find it again on Twitter. But I know Chris Cyborg had mentioned some stuff, was talking with somebody about pay, right? And a couple people were essentially saying that, you talk about Bellator having, better pay for better people and all this stuff. And, that's just not true. Look at these payouts, because payouts from Bellator 283 had been revealed. And yeah, some of the pay was quite low, right? Some ranked fighters or newly ranked fighters are making 25 or 30 and 30, which is significantly lower than, say, in the UFC, where usually those guys are making at least 50-50 minimum. If you're in the rankings, almost usually 60 or 60 to 80 range, right? Depends on the tier system. But there seems to be this notion that a higher wage share between fighters in a promotion, which means promotion makes X amount of revenue and 50% goes to the fighters instead of, say, the UFC's model, which is 20%. There seems to be this notion that all fighters should get a wage bump from that. And that's not the case, right? There's the overall wage share between fighters as a whole versus the promotion, but then there is a pay share within that fighter pay amount where the top guys are always going to make significantly more than new people. And even middling guys. And in Bellator's case, right, when you look at some of these payouts, you see that the bigger names, right, Lorenz Larkin made, I forget exactly how much, but a fair amount of money, 6 figures easy. You have champs or bigger names drawing much higher pay. And then you've got sponsorships and stuff outside of that as well. So Bellator obviously allows for a lot more freedom in the sponsorship arena and doing deals and things outside of the promotion. But within the pay structure itself, we've got to go back to the conversation we had a long time ago, and that I've revisited a couple times here, on the competitive advantage model and scarcity, right? What makes a promotion have a competitive advantage is a asymmetry value, and then either cost dynamics, meaning that they can produce that value significantly cheaper than their competitors, or a scarcity resource, a resource that other competitors don't have access to or as much access to, that allows your product to be superior, product or service to be superior. So when we talk about scarcity in MMA terms, and this has been brought up a long time ago in some of John Nash's articles, I've brought it up in a couple articles, and we've talked about it on this podcast. Scarcity is championship fighters, ranked fighters, right? You have, I don't know how many MMA fighters out there. Thousands, I'd say, easily. I don't know the exact number, but thousands of MMA fighters out there. But where the scarcity that elevates your promotion over others lies is in those top 5%, top 10% of guys, right? If you look at just the UFC, for example, they've got 600 fighters or around that. They, goes up and goes down depending on the particular year and time of the year, but around 600 fighters at any given time. And the guys that are making the most money are those ranked guys or those big name guys that came in with a reputation, that are drawing eyeballs, all that type of stuff. Guys that are making waves. Those are a very small percentage of the overall fighters on the roster. And that is, even 10% is too generous. I'd say 5% or less in terms of scarcity, right? That's where the value lies. And the pay is going to be skewed towards those higher value fighters. That's just how this works. So when you look at a 5K on Dana White's Contender Series, or a 10K standard UFC contract, or what some of the prelim guys are making on Bellator, which is like 7,500 or 2,500, right? Of course, that's jarring, but that again kind of signals their rank in the scarcity rankings, I guess, if you want to call them that. The scarce, that signals their value in terms of scarcity, because a lot of those prelim guys in the promotions minds, they can go off and find another fighter to replace them pretty easily. It's only when you start to beat more and more guys, when you start to prove your skills and show that you're one of the best, that suddenly you get a higher pay because you are more rare. And make no mistake, again, it's the fighters that are the resource here, the scarce resource. Not the overall amount of fighters in the world, it's the top tier fighters. How many LFA champions have we seen who couldn't quite translate into a UFC or Bellator or PFL or One? How many guys have we seen? I talked about it earlier. Nad Naramini, right? Beat Paddy Pimblett in Cage Warriors, and then goes to the UFC and wins, I think, one fight, two, and then loses a couple, and he's washed out. And that's is what it is. You've got Darren Stewart, the dentist, who is a little bit more of a named guy, right? Fighting in Cage Warriors again after losing, despite, having a great run in Cage Warriors. We've seen plenty of guys reach the top of regional promotions or feeder leagues and then not be able to translate it into the highest level of the sport, which is PFL, One, Bellator, and UFC, right? We've seen that happen. So those promotions are going to pay, especially those first timers, no matter how good they look, they're going to get paid quite a bit less until they really prove they can hang there. Paddy Pimblett talked about it, right? There was the fake payouts, which we're going to talk about next week, because I just saw something that just infuriates me. I just saw it today, so I didn't have time to add it in, but we'll discuss that. My favorite topic for regular listeners. But, the fake payout about how much Paddy made, and then he came back and said, I think he said he made 24K or something like that on his first fight. That is the promotion valuing your scarcity at a certain level. Now, should there be a higher minimum base to be at that level, right? Should entry-level guys be making more money at the start regardless? Yes, that's something you can easily argue. You can argue against it. It just depends on, your viewpoint on that. But no matter what, this notion that these guys that are champions in feeder leagues, or that come in even with a little bit of a following like Paddy and then make it to a bigger league, should get paid 80 and 80 or 100 and 100 grand. That only makes sense if then champs are making significantly more money from a business perspective anyway, right? Think about any business you've known. The CEO always makes a stupid amount above the baseline employee. And it's all about scarcity. In the company's mind, there are only a select few people that can run the whole company, that have the experience to be a CEO, COO, be part of that C-suite. Whereas if you are if we're talking about Walmart, right? Or, yes, a very American example. If you're talking about Walmart, if you're talking about any American company, right? But Walmart specifically, I think, is a good example for this, because if you look at the amount of people that could feasibly lead Walmart, this giant international conglomerate, versus the cashiers at Walmart, much easier to replace a cashier, right? Hypothetically, much easier to, okay, a cashier isn't living up to expectations. Great. We will fire them and we will find a new one and it will be fine. Or in some cases, automate it with self-checkout. Much easier to do that versus, oh, our CEO isn't working out and we paid them all this money. Well, here's all these golden parachute clauses and all these other things and the amount of stock they own. And okay, this is going to be a very tumultuous time and our investors are going to look at this. It's a very big difference between the leader at the top versus one of those at the front line. And again, I'm not arguing in terms of the front line shouldn't be paid more. That's not what I'm saying here. But it's important to distinguish that difference, is that even if the front line was paid more, it's still going to be relative to the top producers. That's how the sport works. It's how almost any sport works, right? Take MLB versus MMA. If you've got, or NBA, LeBron gets paid a lot more than one of the guys who's on the bench and who might get a couple minutes in, or has literally just made the team and is on the bench and helps on the practice squad, right? Football, same type of deal. You get signed to a practice squad, you're making a lot less money than if you're on the actual team. If you're one of the backup guys, if you're the third string quarterback, you're not making the same amount of money as Joe Burrow. If you're a third string Cincinnati guy, you're not making anywhere near the same amount of money as Joe Burrow. Yes, you can argue that third string should get at least this amount of money so they can live and do all that. That's fine. But you cannot have this perception that the top guys should be making what they're making now, and then any increase in fighter wage share should go to those bottom guys, because that's just not how businesses tend to work. You can make that argument, but in this day and age, that's not how businesses thrive, right? It's a higher cost for less value or perceived value, which in the case of something like UFC, which is now part of a publicly traded company, that's part of the reason they're cutting guys, and especially more veteran guys making money. It's all about cutting costs. They need their costs low to appease investors. It's just the way the system works. So important to keep that in mind, especially as we continue to see fighter wage share being talked about. When you have the updates in the antitrust lawsuit, which hopefully will, finally we'll get another update here soon, one would hope. Or when you're talking about, the fact that, yes, Bellator does closer to a 50-50 split with fighters, means, people like Chris Cyborg, who says she's made more money than she did in the UFC and all that. Yeah, they're going to see more of that revenue than some of these prelims guys. Because Bellator is also not making nearly $1 billion in revenue, right? I forget what the last profit numbers were, but they just got profitable. And actually, we're starting to make significant-ish profit, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago. Not that long ago. Maybe 4. It's time's blurred because of the pandemic. But yeah, it's not been a long time where Bellator has been making a fair amount of actual profit here. And so when you consider all of that, and you look at the actual revenue they're bringing in, yes, closer to 50%. We know from court documents and from fighter testimony and all that. Bellator is closer to a 50-50 wage share split. But within that 50% that goes to fighters, you're still going to have, I'd say 75, maybe higher than that, 80. I'd have to really think about it and look at some of the numbers, to be honest. Most of that's going to name value fighters. That's just how it goes, right? And the idea is that, again, if you come into Bellator, you make a name for yourself, you start to deliver, you'll be able to get more sponsorships. You will get a pay bump because the promotion will see your value and give you that bump. But if you're first coming in, you're still not making anywhere near what those big guys are. And you're still making in promotions like Bellator and PFL, you're almost certainly making less than you would at the UFC, just because the UFC, even though it's only 20% of revenue share, I mean, they make more money in general, a lot more money in general, multiples upon multiples. So that's part of what you're saying there. So if you have any questions on that, let me know. Curious to get thoughts of people that disagree with this, if more money should go to the prelim guys and those guys that are just up and coming. Because again, I'm not saying that entry bar shouldn't be raised, right? You shouldn't get closer to, I don't know, 20 and 20 or something, or 30 and 30, that type of stuff. But it's prize fighting for a reason, where the champs and the contenders are the ones, or the name value fighters are going to make the majority of that revenue share. I don't see that changing anytime soon. But let me know your thoughts on it, because curious to see what you guys think on the subject. All right, that wraps up another episode of the Fight Business Podcast. Appreciate y'all for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit that like, subscribe, bell notification. If you're listening on Anchor, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, appreciate the love as always. Let me know your thoughts and questions. Still am working on some other stuff. It's getting closer, but I'm probably going to be a couple months out, if I'm being honest, just to kind of dot some of the I's and cross some of the T's on some of these bigger conversations and videos we're going to do. But appreciate the love as always. And until next time, get money.